Welcome to the Reason and Theology Show. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Wednesday evening, joined by Eric Ibarra, a Roman Catholic, and also Tomaszewski, who is Christopher Tomaszewski, who is a Roman Catholic. And we're going to be discussing the issue of the modal collapse argument. So let me go ahead and first introduce you and greet you. How are you, Christopher?
Very good, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. I'm very excited about this show. Eric, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Michael. I'm blessed to be here.
Same here. All right. Well, let me also introduce you here formally. And I'm sorry, I actually should have had your bio pulled up here. I believe that you are currently working on a PhD with Baylor University. Is that not correct, Christopher?
That's right. I'm doing a PhD at Baylor in philosophy. This is my 5th year here at Baylor. I'm actually working with Alex Proust primarily. He's my advisor.
Who was your advisor? I'm sorry, I didn't catch that last bit.
Sorry, Alexander Proust.
And how long have you been doing the program?
This is my 5th year here. The beginning of my 5th year.
5th year. Okay, so I imagine you're wrapping it up at this point.
That's right.
Okay, good deal. Well, yeah, I got your bio pulled up here. Sorry about that. So
No
Christopher is a PhD student in philosophy at Baylor University, specializing in metaphysics, medieval philosophy, especially Thomism, and he is and also philosophy of religion. He previously received an MA in philosophy from the University of Connecticut and a BA in philosophy and a BS in mathematics from Villanova University. He is the author of the articles "The Principle of Sufficient Reason Defended," "There is no conjunction, there's no conjunction of all contingency true propositions in Philosophia," and "Collapsing the Modal Collapse Argument on an Invalid Argument Against Divine Simplicity in Analysis." And that's in fact what I read in preparation for this. I found it very interesting. And by the way, anybody who's listening or watching, please go and you can just find it on academia.com, I think is the website. It's available for free. Again, "Collapsing the Modal Collapse Argument." Just type in Christopher Tomaszewski and you'll find it. It's very interesting, very short. So there, it's not going to be anything cumbersome, but I find it very intriguing because you're dealing with a lot of issues or one particular issue that you're a whole lot addressed when it comes to Eastern Orthodox objections for Roman Catholicism, especially its position on divine simplicity. So maybe if you could perhaps tell us what exactly is the modal collapse argument? Why use the word mode? Where is this coming from? And what exactly is the argument?
Sure. Yeah. So it's an objection to the doctrine of divine simplicity. And of course, the doctrine of divine simplicity, or at least the more extreme versions of it that are defended by St. Thomas Aquinas and other medieval philosophers in the West, claims, among other things, right, that there are no distinctions in God, that all of God's attributes are identical with himself, with his essence, with all his other attributes, etc., etc. And in Thomism, at least, which is coming out of Aristotelianism, part of what would be counted as a divine attribute or a divine property, if you will, that would be identified with God under the doctrine of divine simplicity would be God's actions. So action is one of the 10 categories for Aristotle, and therefore also for Thomas Aquinas. And since God doesn't have any accidents, if we're going to say that God undertakes action in some way, the doctrine of divine simplicity is then going to kick in and say, okay, well, that action has to be identical with God. It can't just be an accident inhering in God. For example, Aristotle and Aquinas would say, if I'm playing basketball, right, there's a certain accident in me of action playing basketball that's inhering in me, just like any of my other properties or accidents, my size, my location, my position, etc., etc. But for God, things are radically different. God's actions are not accidents inhering in him, rather they are him. And so the proponent of the modal collapse argument thinks that this now gets the this makes the doctrine of divine simplicity inconsistent with the doctrine of divine freedom, that God is free, especially with respect to his decision to create or not to create, and his decision to create the kind of world that he ends up creating. So it's called the modal collapse just because it deals with possibility and necessity, which are modes of making a proposition, right? You can state a proposition simply, or you can state it under a mode, right? You can say not just that Booth killed Lincoln, but that it was possible that Booth killed Lincoln, or it's necessary that Booth killed Lincoln, and so on. And so when the opponent of divine simplicity is claiming that it leads to a modal collapse, what they're claiming is that it leads to a collapse, so to speak, of all the possibilities of what God could do down into the necessity of what he actually does. So what they're ultimately claiming is that God could not have done otherwise than he actually does. So that his actions become necessary. Obviously, if that were true, it would be I think I say in the paper in analysis from the outset, if that were true, it would be devastating to the doctrine of divine simplicity. I mean, if that were actually true, then I think the opponents of divine simplicity would win. They'd be right, and we should give up on divine simplicity because it's very clear that God is free, that he created freely, and even apart from theological considerations that we have as theological commitments that we have as Christians, it's just obvious that the world could have been otherwise than it actually is.
And you're essentially arguing that the entire argument is invalid. And not only that this particular problem that they're proposing, for instance, Orthodox who would say this, or perhaps a Protestant like Richard Mullins who would use the argument would say, you're saying, well, this problem actually confronts them too, because you say it's one which confronts every theist who believes that God exists necessarily and is the creator. So how do you argue that this is number one, invalid, and number two, even if it were valid, it's aimed at everybody who believes in monotheism?
Right. So my objection to their argument, I guess, let me first lay out what the argument is, then I'll say what my two objections are to it, which, as you correctly noted, one objection is that the argument, this specific version of the argument, at least, is just formally invalid, and that it's not even controversial that arguments of this form are invalid. And that number two, even if it were valid, then we could actually get a version of this argument that would have nothing to do with divine simplicity at all. It would result in a modal collapse for anybody who's an Abrahamic theist, not just Christians, but Jews and Muslims, anybody who believes that God exists necessarily and is a creator. So I guess let me just talk a little bit about what the argument is, first of all. So basically the view is, as I said, if we're going to end up having God identified with his action, and we think that creation is an action that he's taking, then what we get ultimately is that God is his act of creation. All right, creation is not just something that God does, he is that act of creation. And then the idea behind Mullins' argument, I use Mullins in the paper because he's clearest about what the form of the argument is. But this is also, I should just note that I'm not beating up on Mullins. This is the argument in its broad strokes can also be found in Brian Leftow, J.P. Moreland, and William Lane Craig. They all make appeals to this same kind of basic intuition. And to flesh that intuition out argumentatively, basically, the argument goes like this, right? Necessarily, God exists. And who can argue with that as a Christian, or as I said, as any kind of Abrahamic theist, who could deny that necessarily God exists? That's their first premise. Number two, God is identical to God's act of creation. Now, lots of Christians may want to argue with that, but Thomists and other supporters of strong divine simplicity are not going to be able to argue with that. We are, in fact, committed to that. And so what they argue follows from that is the conclusion, necessarily God's act of creation exists. So basically what they've said is necessarily God exists, God is identical to God's act of creation, therefore necessarily God's act of creation exists. It sounds like a great argument at first, but as I show in the paper, it's actually formally invalid, and it's I don't think it's even controversial that it's formally invalid. So the easiest way to see this just outside of a theological context is to look at the example that I borrow from Quine in the paper. Right, we could say necessarily 8 is greater than 7. That's true, right? Because numbers exist necessarily. They have the properties that they have necessarily. 8 could not possibly be less than 7. So necessarily 8 is greater than 7. The number of the planets is 8. I actually modified the example a little bit from Quine because he uses 9, but we live in a world of 8 planets now. So the second premise is the number of planets is 8. That's identical to 8. And so if an argument of this form were valid, what would follow is that necessarily the number of planets is greater than 7. And it's actually pretty clear that that doesn't follow. It can't follow because it's obvious that the number of planets is not necessarily greater than 7. There could have been 5, there could have been 3, and so on. So the point of that example is that it's just a formal counterexample to the argument. It shows that it can't be valid because the premises of this counterexample are obviously true, right? It's obviously true that 8 is necessarily greater than 7 and that the number of the planets is identical to 8. And it's obviously false that necessarily the number of the planets is greater than 7. So that's just a formal counterexample to the argument. This is the standard way of showing in philosophy that an argument is invalid. You just take a substitution instance of the argument where the premises are obviously and uncontroversially true and the conclusion is obviously and uncontroversially false. And so this would be a counterexample showing that the argument is invalid. But I go on from there, right, to, as you mentioned, to point out that opponents of divine simplicity actually, if they want to hold on to Abrahamic theism, ought to hope that this argument is invalid because I can give another substitution instance having the same form, which has nothing to do with divine simplicity at all, and still results in a modal collapse. So that would look like this. Necessarily God exists. That's the same premise they start with. God is identical to the creator, right? All I've done there is changed God is identical to his act of creation to God is identical to the creator. And what would pop out from that if this form of argument were valid would be necessarily the creator exists. And of course, if necessarily a creator exists, he can't be a creator without a creation. And so you'd have this same kind of modal collapse, right? I could even make it more specific by going back to premise 2 and saying something like, God is identical to the creator of Christopher, right? And then what would pop out in the conclusion is necessarily the creator of Christopher exists. And that would then necessitate my existence. And I could go back and change 2 to creator of anything, to make anything in the world that I want to be necessary. And I could just keep running arguments of this form to make everything in the world end up being necessary. And so, right, as I said, what that shows is, number 1, the argument's not valid. And number 2, it's not actually an objection to divine simplicity, to the doctrine of divine simplicity. It's going to, if in fact I were wrong about it being invalid, it would constitute a successful objection to Abrahamic theism, not just to the rather small subset of Abrahamic theists who hold to Aquinas's doctrine of divine simplicity.
Mm-hmm. You know, let me make sure I'm getting this straight though. You're essentially saying and correct me if I'm wrong, essence equals creator, but it's not necessarily the case that creator equals the essence of God, because God was free to choose to create. Once he chooses to create, then you could maybe say that, but there's nothing that necessitated God to create. Is that correct?
That's right. So another way of putting it, so if you want to just take that last counterexample that I just used about God is identical to the creator, what Aquinas would say about that, right, is that when we call God creator, we are not in fact naming the essence, so to speak, the way that we're naming the essence when we say that God is powerful, because there we actually are saying God is identical to his power. Or when we say that God is intelligent, or God has knowledge, we actually are naming the essence. We're saying that God is his knowledge and so forth. But when it comes to things like saying that God is a creator, what Aquinas would say, right, is that we are not in fact naming his essence. We are describing a relation that creatures have to him. Right? So it'd be much the same way as if I had a younger brother, right? And I said, I'm taller than him. And then my little brother grows up, he ends up being even taller than me. And at that point, it would be true of me to say that I went from being taller than him to being shorter than him.
But you didn't change.
That's right. So the idea is there are certain predicates here that you can truly make of me, true predications you can make of me, which are nevertheless grounded in changes that are taking place somewhere else, not in me. Yeah.
But God did choose to create, and so right. Wouldn't there be some necessity there? I mean, and if he's free, why did he choose to create rather than not create, if his will is identical to his essence?
Sure. So let me take the second question first, because so why did he choose to create? I mean, good. I can't get, that's way beyond my pay grade, right? But of course, we could say something about what motivates God to create, right? We could say, well, it's because it's good, right? It would go all the way back to Genesis. Why did God create? Because what he created is good.
But not because he's lacking any goodness.
That's right. So it's important to note, I guess, when we say that God created because it's good, it's not that he became better, right? It's that we got to participate in his goodness.
Yeah.
But to come back to, I guess, your first question, so God did choose to create. Yeah, I don't think anything in Aquinas' doctrine of divine simplicity requires me to say that God didn't choose to create, or that his choice is completely inexplicable. I guess all the Thomists end up being committed to saying is that when God chooses and when God acts, he's very different from us in the following way. That when I make a choice and I act, I do two things happen. I bring about a change in the world, right? And the world, in a sense, brings about a change in me. For example, if I were to get up from my chair right now and go to the refrigerator to get a glass of water, I would bring about a change in the world. Right? I would make noise, I would move the water around, et cetera, et cetera. But changes would also take place in me, right? I would no longer be seated. I'd go from seated to standing. I would have to walk. I would ingest water, which would change my body chemistry, et cetera, et cetera. So basically what's going on, right, is that in creatures, whenever there's action taking place, there's also passion taking place. I can't act on the world without change also taking place in me. Even if that change is ultimately just a psychological change, like I go from thinking about one topic to another. What is very different in God and what is mysterious about God's action is that he affects changes external to him without undergoing any internal change.
Mhm.
And that's, I don't think that proponents of Aquinas' doctrine of divine simplicity should try to escape or deny that that is very mysterious. And in fact, I'm currently in the process of doing one or more papers trying to get at this deeper issue.
I'd love to read that one when you're finished with them. Let me just back it up just for a moment, and let's define, first of all, simplicity for anybody who's watching that isn't familiar with the term. And then my other question after that is going to be, how do you think Richard Mullins responds to your argument refuting him and his
just for the record, his name is Ryan Mullins.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it was Richard.
Yeah.
RT Mullins, correct?
Yeah, he usually abbreviates it RT, but his name is Ryan.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So how would he respond to what you're saying as far as his criticism in use of that argument?
Yeah. So I've had a handful of very short exchanges with him on Facebook about how he would respond, and basically the answer I've gotten back is that he is currently in the process of authoring a formal reply that I assume he'll try to publish. But that he did also note, however, though, that he thinks that the Maverick Philosopher blog post that appeared captures the heart of his reply.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you can also define simplicity for me too before we get too far down the road.
Sure. So I know I went over that a little quickly at the beginning there. So the doctrine of divine simplicity, at least as Aquinas and most of his medieval contemporaries would define it, just says that God doesn't have parts. And the way that we talk about parts for somebody like Aquinas is extremely broad. He doesn't just mean parts in the sense that we typically mean it, like when we say that my arm is a part of me, or that the back of my chair is a part of my chair, or something like that. That's just one kind of part that Aquinas is imagining when he says that God lacks all parts. So, for example, he's going to think that more broadly, right, Aquinas' ontology is one in which, for example, substances are composites of form and matter. So he's going to say, okay, well, in God, there can't be that composition of form and matter. God has to be pure form. And he's going to think more broadly in his ontology that substances also have a composition of subject and accident. So there's me, the subject, and then there's all the accidents inhering in me, according to the 10 classic Aristotelian categories. And he's going to say, okay, in God, we can't have that. Right? So God is not, God doesn't have an accident of goodness inhering in him, rather, and that's not to say he's not good, it's just to say that he is his goodness. Aquinas would actually say that it means that God is good in a much more radical and more fundamental way than any creature could possibly be good. And likewise, when we say that God has knowledge, it's going to end up identifying God with his knowledge, or that when we say God has will, it's going to identify God with his will, and so on. And then, of course, there's the classic composition of essence and existence that Aquinas thinks happens in creatures, and he's going to say again that composition can't be taking place in God. God has to be such that his essence is his existence. And so, right, I mean, an easy way to just find out what Aquinas is thinking about simplicity is to just go into the first part of the Summa Theology and read question 3, the question on simplicity, because he's extremely methodical there. He tells you these are the kinds of composition I'm ruling out when I say that God is simple.
Okay. And I have a few more follow-ups, but let me go ahead and get to Eric here. I know he has some comments and probably a few questions for you.
Sure.
Yeah. So, as you know, there has been a lot of controversy with divine simplicity in modern philosophy. Can you give a few examples of philosophers who have taken issue with this to a significant level that bears the worth mentioning?
Sure. Yeah. So I talk a little bit about this in the beginning of my paper. The modal collapse objection that I've been talking about is just one of a host of objections that theistic personalists or neo-theists, as they tend to get called by classical theists such as myself, it's just one objection that's lodged against the doctrine of divine simplicity. Perhaps the single most famous work objecting to divine simplicity from contemporary philosophy is Plantinga's 1980 little volume called "Does God Have a Nature?" Where, unfortunately, I think he gives an extremely poor caricature of what divine simplicity ends up entailing, where he just dismisses it on the basis that it makes God into a property. And whatever God is, he certainly isn't a property. And, Plantinga is right about that. God couldn't be a property. That's why it's very important that, for example, when Aquinas says that God is his own act of existence, for example, he doesn't just say he's existence, period. He says that he is subsisting existence. He's existence in a substantial way. Or when he says that God is his own goodness, he's not just saying God is goodness implicator, right? He's not identical to the goodness that inheres in me, for example. He's subsistent goodness. He's goodness existing in a substantial way. So that's, although it's probably the most famous work objecting to divine simplicity in the contemporary literature, it's, I don't think, very cogent as an objection. Then you have people like J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig who argue that it's inconsistent with the Trinity. And you can kind of see how that would fall out if you had a certain view of what the Trinity is, right? So if you have a view of the Trinity that's like a social Trinitarian model, on which the persons are in some way or another conceived of as parts of the Godhead, then obviously, yeah, divine simplicity is going to be inconsistent with that view of the Trinity. But I think the correct conclusion to draw from that inconsistency is not that the doctrine of divine simplicity is false, but that social models of the Trinity or any model of the Trinity which makes the persons out to be parts of the Godhead is just a really bad model. If we're going to criticize divine simplicity as being inconsistent with the Trinity, the least I think that we can do to be fair to Aquinas and other proponents of the doctrine is to actually ask the question of whether the doctrine of divine simplicity is consistent with classical theists' own model of the Trinity. And if it turned out it was inconsistent with our own model of the Trinity, that would be a problem. And if it turns out that you don't like our model of the Trinity, then you should just criticize that directly instead of making it an issue about the doctrine of divine simplicity. Christopher Hughes is another author that I mentioned in the paper who talks about worries about the consistency of the doctrine of divine simplicity with the incarnation. But I think much of what I just said about the Trinity applies there as well. It's inconsistent with some models of the incarnation, to be sure. But the question, I think, the interesting question would be just whether it's inconsistent with Aquinas or other classical theists' own model of the incarnation. And if it is, then the real dispute or the real dispute there is just on what model of the incarnation is correct, and we can have that argument separately.
Yeah, you had mentioned the objection on the of the Trinitarian persons posing a problem for the doctrine of divine simplicity. This comes up quite a bit nowadays. It's regaining a lot of traction in the blogosphere. I get questions regularly now from people I have never even met, they're asking me to answer this question on how do you have this absolutely singular monad, or this, this undifferentiated simplicity, and then how does the three divine persons not just disappear in that? And you had made note of the issue of parts, and that's perfectly right. That's kind of how they come into the question, because three parts would definitely put a collapse to that undifferentiated simplicity.
Yeah.
But Aquinas teaches that each of the three divine persons is equal to the divine essence.
Yeah.
Could you briefly touch on that, or on what Aquinas? And then I know Aquinas talked about how you can have action and passion on one singular, essence, and it's an analogy for how something can be singular and yet coming from a certain relation, it has these distinctions.
Right. Okay. So this is deep into the weeds of Thomistic metaphysics, but sure. So right, as you pointed out, the doctrine of divine simplicity is certainly not incompatible with Aquinas' own view of the Trinity, theory of the Trinity, because on Aquinas' doctrine of the Trinity, each person is identical with the divine essence, not a part of the divine essence or the Godhead. And so no issue of making room for the persons, so to speak, ever arises, of making room for the persons in the Godhead. Because each person in some sense is the whole thing, is the whole Godhead. And so we don't have to carve the Godhead up into parts to deal with, in a way that would be incompatible with the doctrine of divine simplicity. Of course, then that raises its own issue, right? I suspect that most theistic personalists or non-classical theists would say, well, so much the worse for Aquinas, right? He's escaped the frying pan of inconsistency between the doctrine of divine simplicity and the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, but only at the price of making the Trinity incoherent, perhaps in precisely the way that atheists or other non-Trinitarian Christians accuse it of being, right? How could it be that each person is identical to the divine essence without being identical to each other? And that's where Aquinas calls upon his Aristotelian metaphysics again in a very special way, because out of the 10 categories, he thinks that one of them is very special, the category of relation. And the reason he thinks that the category of relation is very special is because he thinks that there are, in a sense, two aspects to relations in a way that there aren't two aspects to every other category. These are typically called esse in and esse ad. So esse in is just the relation insofar as it's inhering in the subject of the relation. So I'm my father's son, so I bear the relation of son to my father. The bit that the bit that inheres in me, right? The aspect of that relation, insofar as it inheres in me, is what Aquinas would, or I don't know if Aquinas ever uses this term himself, but certainly later Thomists call esse in. It's the relation insofar as it inheres in me as a subject.
Right.
But then there's the relational aspect of the relation, right? There's the part that makes it not just be any kind of accident, but a relation that gets called esse ad, or being toward, right? Being toward. And that's exactly the character that relations have, right? Part of being a son is having a certain relation toward something that's external to me, something namely my Father. And so what Aquinas says is that in the Trinity, although each person is identified with the divine essence, they're not identified with each other because, to put it in a somewhat simplistic way, he thinks that there's kind of an exception to what we would nowadays call the transitivity of identity. So he says, yeah, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, except when he says there's a relation of opposition between A and C. So he gives an example of this in the created order when he's addressing this issue of the transitivity of identity. He says that action is a kind of motion, right? And passion can be that very same motion. So just to give a concrete example, I have, it's my cell phone right here. If I push the phone to the other side of the screen, there's an action that's taken place, my pushing of the phone, and there's also a passion that's taken place, the phone's moving. And what Aquinas would say is those are the same motion, right? My moving the phone and the phone's being moved are the same motion. And nevertheless, it's not the case that my pushing the phone is the same thing as the phone's being moved. So action is motion, passion is motion, but action isn't passion. And so he says the same thing is going on in the Trinity. The Father is the divine essence and the Son is the divine essence, but nevertheless, the Father is not the Son because there's a relation of opposition between them. The Father has this relation, esse ad, toward the Son, and the Son has the reciprocal relation. And this relation distinguishes them even though they're both identical to a third, thing. And so that's like I said, a somewhat simplistic explanation of how Aquinas tries to deal with this.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. That was fantastic. We got this on recording. I can't believe it. That was a great explanation. Sure. You know, a lot of the times we miss those Trinitarian debates in the early centuries. How often our church fathers, they were using Greek metaphysics to try and put this all together. Oftentimes we miss the artificial nature of it. That's the beauty of it, is we're trying to make sense of divine revelation. But Aquinas comes and uses Aristotelian categories and a framework of thinking. And I really appreciate how you called attention to criticism towards simplicity should be through the gateway of the Trinity or the Incarnation, should first be calibrated to the proper coherence model of the Incarnation and the Trinity of the Thomist, because often we are just sidelined in the middle of nowhere. Somebody's coming with all this thinking from a foreign discipline, and they're trying to they actually T-bone instead of confronting it head on. So yeah, you mentioned Moreland and William Lane Craig. We've heard them come out. They've been outspoken against divine simplicity. But let's get back to this issue of the modal collapse. That's the point of your the whole point of your article and the show here. You do a service on their behalf and try to come up with ways that they can repair or fix up or reshape their objection so that it doesn't necessitate, as you showed, their invalidity. Could you talk about how you do that service for them, and then show why it doesn't actually get them to survival on that point?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess this goes back to why exactly the argument as it's stated is invalid. So just to remind your viewers, right, the argument was necessarily God exists. God is identical to God's act of creation. Therefore, necessarily God's act of creation exists. What I show in the paper is that as is invalid. But I point to a couple ways you could make it valid. And I could talk about the first one of those. If you want to get into the others, I'd be happy to do that. So the easiest way to make it valid would just be to add a necessity operator outside in front of the second premise. So instead of saying just that God is identical to God's act of creation, we could say that necessarily God is identical to God's act of creation. And if we were to do that, that would then validate the argument. It would follow from those two premises. Number one, necessarily God exists, and number two, necessarily God is identical to God's act of creation, that necessarily God's act of creation exists. So that's a way of repairing the argument in terms of making it valid. But what I say in the paper is that this comes at the cost of making it unsound, because although the classical theist is committed to God being identical to God's act of creation, he's not committed to the claim that necessarily God is identical to God's act of creation. And so it's open to the classical theist to simply deny that premise. Now, the theistic personalist, the opponent of divine simplicity, could say, oh, but it's true. But that's, in the context of this debate, they could say it's true whether you agree with it or not. But in the context of this debate, that kind of retort would be just dialectically not well situated, mostly owing to the fact that their original claim was that the doctrine of divine simplicity just outright entailed a modal collapse.
Right.
And so the only premises they're entitled to in a demonstration that the doctrine of divine simplicity entails a modal collapse are the premises that the doctrine of divine simplicity is actually committed to. Otherwise, what you're really saying is not that the doctrine of divine simplicity entails a modal collapse, but that the doctrine of divine simplicity, together with some other stuff that classical theists don't agree with, that isn't part of the doctrine of divine simplicity, entails a modal collapse.
Right.
So it's open there. I argue to just say that to just reject their premise two once it's been changed from God is identical to God's act of creation to necessarily God is identical to God's act of creation. And here's where I think a lot of misunderstanding comes up. Basically, the one of the common replies I get when I point that out is they say, well, no, aren't all identities necessary, right? If A is identical to B, then necessarily A is identical to B. And this is where language gets very tricky. And it starts to come apart from our metaphysics. So I'm not denying in this paper or anywhere else, because I think it would be foolish to do so, that identity is necessary, right? If A is identical to B, then necessarily A is identical to B. But metaphysics is one thing and language is another, right? So while all identities are necessary, not all identity statements are necessarily true, right? That's a really important point, so I'll just repeat it. While all identities are necessary, not all identity statements are necessarily true. There's a difference between them. And the reason is this. Here's a good example, right? We say Donald Trump is identical to the President of the United States. That's an identity claim, right? We're saying that the President of the United States and Donald Trump are identical to one another.
Right.
And of course, it's also true that, Donald Trump is necessarily identical to Donald Trump, right? It couldn't be the case that he stopped being self-identical. That's the sense in which I'm saying, yeah, identities are always necessary.
Right.
But identity statements like the one I just gave are not always necessarily true, right? Because it's false. It's obviously false that necessarily Donald Trump is identical to the President of the United States, because he didn't have to be president. It could have been the case that he was never president. And in fact, it has been the case. Not only is it not necessary, but it was only a few years ago actually false, that he was identical to the president of the United States. Barack Obama was identical to the president instead. And so you have to be really, the lesson here is that you have to be really careful when you're trying to capture necessary claims about identity in language, because language is very slippery when it comes to trying to put identity claims together with necessity claims. So that's one way you could repair the argument, and what I'm claiming is that it just turns it from an invalid argument to an unsound argument, where the second premise is false, or even if it's not false, at the end of the day, it's something that proponents of divine simplicity are not committed to, and so it's not something that's going to let you show that the doctrine standing on its own entails a modal collapse.
Right.
And that any attempt to say that the identity statement has to be necessarily true is going to run into these classical problems that we have concerning the difference between identity being necessary and the truth of an identity claim being necessary. And I'm not reinventing the wheel here. That's coming straight out of decades old philosophy, in particular Saul Kripke's work about the difference between metaphysical identity and semantic identity claims.
Yeah, excellent. We had mentioned before we get into this brief issue of the corruptionism, because I know the audience, we're getting a lot of good feedback here on the comments, and they're probably going to want to hear of that very intriguing subject that you're doing a dissertation on. But the Eastern Orthodox Church. I don't want to say Eastern Orthodox Church. I know plenty of Eastern Orthodox Christians who would not pose this challenge to the Catholics, but there are some out there who would say that St. Thomas Aquinas' doctrine of divine simplicity has no welcome to the division or the distinction between God's operations or his energies and his essence. And this is really the starting point of Gregory Palamas and his doctrine of the energies of God and the essence of God, is how humans can participate in God. Mm-hmm. And so, every theist knows that God is timeless, he's impassible, he's outside, he's transcendent. And so, there's this deep mystery of how, what happens. Is there like a whole that is made, and through timelessness to time, there is this movement from God into the temporal time-space continuum so that we could actually participate in God? A lot of Orthodox will say, we don't believe in absolute divine simplicity. We believe that we actually see God, we touch God. When God came down in the burning bush, he wasn't looking at some, meager creature thing that's effective, symbolizing God, but we're looking at God, Mm-hmm. How do you think that Aquinas might look at this question of how you've got this big gulf between creatures and the Creator, and yet the Christian gospel has always said that the two come into union? How do you think Aquinas would look at this issue and account for the fact that, on the one hand, the Bible does teach that we participate in God? We actually partake in his very being. While at the same time, there's this infinite gulf that can never be closed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If you can comment that, if not, we'll just, that's a big, in fact, it's really it's untouched in the English. Well, I don't want to say it's untouched, but there aren't a lot of English works that have been, short enough for the sheep of philosophy to read. A lot of this stuff is way up there where the giraffes are eating. There's not a lot in the English world in terms of papers, but if you can comment on it or anything. Yeah.
No, I'd be happy to. So this is a really important question, because actually Aquinas himself is attempting to combat, around the same time as Aquinas, there's a view coming up in the West, not just the East, but in the West itself, that what the beatified souls see prior to the resurrection is not God himself, but just the glorified humanity of Christ. And Aquinas is very insistent that no, what we see is the God through his very essence. Now, in terms of seeing God, whether that's in a burning bush, or I think probably in a more direct way when we're talking about the beatific vision, I don't think, I'd be happy to have you give me some further feedback on where the problem is supposed to lie, but I don't immediately see any problem there for the following reason. What the doctrine of divine simplicity makes impossible on Aquinas's view is for God to have any real relation to his creatures. What it doesn't prevent in any way is his creatures having a real relation to him. And so if you think of seeing as a relation, which I think is fine enough for our purposes right now, there's no, I think, even prima facie inconsistency in saying that God is absolutely simple and that we see God even in his very essence. Now, of course, I'm not sure that I agree that biblical accounts like the burning bush are instances of, for example, Moses having the beatific vision. I think those are probably better interpreted, along with, I think, most of the fathers, as kind of Christological vision of Christ as he would appear after the incarnation and so forth, rather than talking about seeing God through his essence. But of course, we do want to say that in heaven, our souls, or us, will actually see God in his very essence. And there, I don't see any problem immediately in saying that God is absolutely simple and that I see him through his essence, because my seeing him through his essence only posits a relation in me to him, and that's fine. As long as I'm not committed to saying that he has some kind of real relation to me, because that would create a dependency of God on me in a way that would be inconsistent with the doctrine. And I think would just be inconsistent with anybody who wants to maintain aseity in general. Participation, I'll admit that's a little bit harder for me to get a grasp on. When I think of participation in the divine attributes, I tend to just think of the way in which the transcendentals that I have of being and goodness and truth, and the non-transcendental, but other ways that I participate in God, such as life and so forth. That participation just consists in the fact that those properties, insofar as I possess them, are analogous to what God is. God is truth, God is goodness, God is being, God is life, and so on. If what you're saying is that there's an interpretation on the part of some Eastern Orthodox that of participation where it actually requires me to partake of the divine essence in such a way, in a really strong, really robust sense that would be a threat to divine simplicity. I'm inclined to say that we have reasons to reject that interpretation of the doctrine of participation independent of divine simplicity, because it's just too close to collapsing the distinction between creator and creature, regardless of whether you think God is simple or not. And now, with respect to a distinction between God's essence and his energies, palimism. Yeah, so sometimes I struggle to figure out what this doctrine actually amounts to. I could say, just to begin, that one reason why Aquinas isn't going to like that is because, following Aristotle, and I'm sure most Eastern Orthodox would say, well, there's where he made his mistake. But following Aristotle, right, he doesn't think that the operations of a thing are something you can just treat as if it's a separate entity from the thing. Again, right, he thinks action or operation is in creatures, at least, is an accident inhering in the subject, right? So right. It's not as if my operations, the things I do, my actions or operations, the things I do are distinct from me, something that have an existence all their own, right? They depend on me in an obvious way, and they're intimately tied up with me. In fact, they're descriptions of how I am, right? Yeah. When you say Christopher's running, it's not as if you can take Christopher's running and treat it as if it's an entity unto itself that can be somehow participated or experienced apart from me. Right. So when Palamites say things like, well, we never see God in his essence, but we experience God in his operations or in his energies, I struggle to see how that, I mean, at the very least, I think what we should say is that is at least as strange as anything that Aquinas is saying, right? Because it's just as much in conflict with our common sense ideas about how things are related to their operations or their activities. Of course, it's open to the Orthodox to reply that, well, God is different. And that would be a fair reply in some ways, right? Because Aquinas is saying the same thing about God. God is different. He's not like the creatures. But it would be helpful to have some further details about why when it comes to God, we get to treat energies or operations or activities as if there's some kind of distinct entity that can be experienced apart from the thing that is doing the operating or the activity or that has the energy. Because at least when we're talking about creatures, those two things are not just, I would say, metaphysically inseparable, but it seems like there might be an incoherency, a logical incoherency, or at least a conceptual incoherency in trying to separate those two. It would be like saying that you can participate in my running without having any kind of interaction with me, right? And that seems to be at least threatening incoherency.
But, actually, the Orthodox are not going to say that. They're first going to affirm his simplicity, and then they're going to say the essence is fully in each energy. So they're not going to sever them so that you're participating in an energy, but insofar as that there's this radical distinction now between energies and essence, but they still want to say, okay, but you don't actually know the divine essence or anything like that. So there is some difficulty there, but I think that they're still going to affirm some of the things that you would be concerned about there. But I think we could talk about that in more detail another time, because I want to ask a quick follow-up question based on something that you just said a moment ago, and then I want to switch topics very briefly to the survivalist corruptionist debate. Now, you said God has no real relation to man, because this would basically make him dependent on us, and then he wouldn't be self-sufficient. But I guess I'm trying to understand, what do you mean then by relation? Because to me, if I'm understanding the term correctly, I have a real relation between myself and my children, but I'm not dependent on my children. So surely that's not what you mean.
Right. Yeah. So even before I get into that, perhaps it's worth just putting like a note of caution here, right? Because I think the first thing that people might be tempted to be worried about when I say that God has no real relation to his creatures is to think of relation as relationship, right? And think that I am contradicting perhaps some core tenet of the gospel, right? That God doesn't have a relationship with us. And of course, I don't mean anything like that, right? I'm not trying to deny that God has that God is in a loving relationship with each of his creatures, especially the personal creatures. I don't think God could be but in a relationship of that kind. What I'm saying is that when we want to cash out that spiritual truth in a metaphysical way, that we should actually put all of the relational work, all the metaphysical work of bearing the relation should be posited in creatures and not in God. So when you say, for example, you're a father, but that doesn't make you dependent on your children, it doesn't make you dependent on your children. If something were to happen for to your children, God forbid, you wouldn't stop existing. But there would be something different about you, right? You would change it in a way, right? You wouldn't be
right.
Of course, we tend to say that people are still fathers, even if their children their children are dead or whatever. But in a certain sense, they're not a father in the same sense. And so even though like it wouldn't, if we posit a real relation on the part of God to creatures, I'm not saying that the dependency would be an existential one, right? It wouldn't be like, oh, well, then if something happened to God's creatures, God would stop existing. But it's a dependency where if something happened to God's creatures, God would then be changed, right? Say, if we want to posit a real relation in God to me as the creator of me, and then I go out of existence, God may still be around, but he's no longer he no longer has that same relation to me because I'm no longer around to be related to him in that way. And so now we have God changing. So right off the bat, we have a problem with immutability now. So it's not that he's existentially dependent on his creatures, but he's now dependent for how he is on his creatures, right? There's now God is different than he otherwise would be due to having this real relation to his creatures. Right, I mean, for Thomas, even that kind of dependency is ruled out by the divine perfection and divine aseity, right? There can't be dependence on the part of God on his creatures, either for his existence or for any aspect of who he is, right? He can't be dependent in any way for who he is on his creatures, not least of all because it would create an explanatory circle, right? Because of course, God is himself responsible for the fact that creatures exist and for every way in which creatures are the way that they are. So if God if even certain aspects, even the smallest aspect of how God ends up getting cashed out or explained in terms of how he's related to creatures, it then ends up being an explanatory circle due to the fact that those features of creatures are ultimately going to trace their way back to God, to the way in which God created them and to the fact that God created them. And now we have God explaining explaining changes in himself. In a sense, he's moving himself. And it's a bedrock metaphysical principle for Aquinas that nothing moves itself. Anything that's moved is moved by another.
Now, let me also briefly touch on this issue with survivalists and corruptionists before we get to some of the questions. I was just looking at some of the questions in the chat, and some of these look interesting. So, but okay, I saw that you wrote a paper. I believe it was a paper. I know you did a presentation on it, so I assume you had a paper to go along with it. Aquinas on Death as Substantial Corruption. Was that also an academic paper?
Yeah, that's part of my dissertation. I've not yet published any of this material, but I presented a lot of it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you could just kind of introduce us to what exactly is the survivalist versus corruptionist debate, and where do you land on it, and why?
Sure. So the survivalist versus corruptionist debate is a dispute among Thomists, but the question that's being debated could easily be addressed to non-Thomists in a way that would make sense, and to which people could give meaningful answers, even if you're not a Thomist. But it's mostly a dispute among Thomists because of what Thomists all agree on. So both survivalists and corruptionist Thomists are all agreed that when human beings die, their soul survives and lives on in the interim state until the resurrection, when God reunifies their souls with their bodies, and they rise from their graves. What they are in disagreement about is whether, along with the souls, the actual human person himself survives death. So the survivalists naturally say that, yes, the human person does survive death in the interim state. Whereas the corruptionist says, no, what is happening at death is the substantial corruption of man. That's a term I'll define in a moment. Man only comes back into existence. The human person only comes back into existence at the resurrection, when the soul is reunified with matter. And so in my dissertation, I defend the latter view, corruptionism, against a whole host of arguments that survivalists have made for why the human person survives in an interim state. So just to clarify the view, because I think this is the first mistake people make about the view, I am not positing a soul sleep theory, nor am I positing an annihilation, any kind of annihilationism about the human person. So I deny that when the human person dies, that nothing is left. And I also deny that when my soul enters the interim state after my death, that it's in some kind of spiritual slumber or state of inactivity. I deny all of that. I think that in the interim state, my soul is very active. It's adoring God and learning and praising God and praying for souls in purgatory if it's in heaven, or for us here on earth. It's doing all kinds of things. But what I claim is that entity, that soul, is not me, and that while it may be doing all kinds of things in interim state, I am not, because I do not exist.
Yeah, and I get exactly what you're saying. It just sounds very hard to grasp, just because there's a part of me that wants to say, well, yes, you do exist because your soul has survived, but I understand where you're coming from, because there's a substantial corruption here.
So if you're more attracted to a Platonic view of the human person, on which the human or a Cartesian view of the human person, on which the human person is simply identified with the soul, then my view goes right out the window, right? So obviously, if the human person is his soul, then as Plato or Descartes would maintain, then obviously I survive my death, right? Or at least if my soul survives, which I say it does, then it would just immediately follow that I survive my death. But that's precisely what the Aristotelian and the Thomists deny, right? For the Aristotelian and the Thomist, man, or the human person, is only the composite of soul and body. And when that composite is destroyed by the soul being separated from the body at death, that's the destruction of me. So before I had used the term substantial corruption. So the basic argument for my view, the simplest argument for my view would go like this. So I guess part of what makes this confusing is talk about persons. So it's easier to just get all the person talk out of it, because I think that's a distraction, at least from this simplest argument for why you should think that the human person doesn't exist in the interim state. The view goes like this, right? If you just adopt Aristotle and Aquinas's broader metaphysical picture, then what you believe, among other things, is that all physical substances are hylomorphic composites of form and matter, right? So that's true of rocks, that's true of water, that's true of plants, it's true of dogs and cats and rabbits, and it's true of men, it's true of human beings. Everything around us that can be sensed, that can be seen, heard, touched, tasted, felt, and is physical, is for Aristotle and Aquinas a hylomorphic composite of body and soul, not body and soul, form and matter. So when we're talking about living things, form and matter get special names, where we call the form soul, because it's the form of a living thing, and we call the matter body. It's the correlate of soul. And so even before we talk about the human person, Aristotle and Aquinas have a theory about how these hylomorphic substances come into existence and go out of existence. And the view about how they come into existence is that substantial form gets united with matter, and a substance is generated, they say, right? This would be the generation of a substance. So you can think of, right, a seed that's been planted, it's going to become a tree. At some point in the germination of that seed, a substantial change takes place where the form of the seed is replaced by the substantial form of a tree, and a tree is generated. And that's how trees come into being. And then, right, let's say some fire comes along, burns the tree down. The opposite process, in some sense, takes place. The substantial form of the tree that was previously inhering in this matter is separated from that matter by the destructive action of the fire, and some new substantial form takes its place, the substantial form of ashes, if ashes are a substance. Let's just say, for the sake of argument now, that they are. That process, right, when substantial form is separated from matter, Aristotle and Aquinas call substantial corruption. Corruption here being a technical word that just means the destruction of a thing, right? So it's a destruction of a substance. So notice so far I haven't said anything about human beings, right? I'm just talking about how do we deal with the, what's our theory about how physical substances, hylomorphic substances, come into existence and go out of existence. And so what I think the basic argument for my view is we should be consistent, right? If we think we're a hylomorphic composite, then we should think that we come into existence and go out of existence in the same way that every other hylomorphic composite comes into and goes out of existence, right? Namely, we come into existence through a process of substantial generation, where at the beginning of our lives, gametes are fused, and the substantial form that had been inhering in those gametes is separated, and God infuses a human soul into this embryo that is being conceived, and I come into existence. I am substantially generated. Just like when the seed, the substantial form of the seed is separated from the seed, and the substantial form of a tree takes its place. and a tree is generated. And I want to say in the same way, when my substantial form, namely the rational soul, because in my case, in the case of me, my substantial form is the rational soul. When that thing is separated from my body, which is exactly what happens in death, that's the definition of death, that constitutes the substantial corruption of me. And just like any other hylomorphic substance that's been corrupted, it constitutes the end of my existence. Of course, it doesn't constitute a permanent end to my existence because at the resurrection, God's going to put that substantial form back with the matter to bring me back into existence. That's what the resurrection is. But at least for that time when my substantial form is separated from my matter, from my body, what survives, namely my substantial form, my soul, that thing isn't me, right? I was destroyed. I was substantially corrupted. You know, you can, I mean, I think part of the motivation for this argument is we can kind of just see that that's what's taking place, at least for those of us who've had the misfortune to actually watch somebody die, right? When somebody dies, it's clear that what's left is some new substance, or actually some new substances. The body has lost its integrity. It's actually become something new, a corpse, and it, you know, it grows cold, it starts decomposing, et cetera, et cetera. This, right, the same way when the tree burns down and we take a handful of the ash and we say, well, look, it's nothing like a tree anymore. It's not. It doesn't have leaves. It doesn't have branches. It doesn't have roots. It doesn't do any of the things that trees do. It's just ashes. The same way we look at a corpse, and you know, that's obviously not me anymore. That's obviously not the person who died. And I think it would be a mistake to say that the soul, the other part, is me either. I was the composite thing that went out of existence when those two parts came apart.
Now, and I totally get it, but it, like you said, it all hinges on where you land on whether a person equals soul, Plato's view, or Descartes' view, or whether a person equals soul and body, composite, Aristotle's
That's right.
view. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. If you're inclined to identify the human person with just the soul, as Plato and Descartes are, then this view goes right out the window, which is part of the reason why it's a dispute among Thomists so much, because the dispute ends very quickly with anybody who's attracted to a Cartesian or a Platonic dualism, where it's like, well, if you say that the soul survives death, then that settles the question of whether I do, because I am my soul. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I really want to tease this out more, but we're up against the clock here. Let's see if we can maybe table this and have perhaps another video where we discuss it more in depth.
I'd be happy to do that.
Along with some of the other presentations that I see you've done, I really have quite a few questions. I think it would be very interesting. Let's go ahead and get to some of the questions from the chat, though. Eric, the first one is for you. It says, does reason and theology really claim to be Catholic and Eastern Orthodox at the same time? I had to.
Well, you know, it's a complex answer. You know, the where this started is Michael and I have known each other for years. And we have always been wrestling with theological issues. And we thought that we were just plumbing the depth of certain subjects. And it was just getting lost in a Facebook chat. We figured, you know, this would be good to put it out there so that while we're doing the same thing we've been doing, other people can kind of chime in, listen, and you know, add their thoughts to it. And then also, you know, we were kind of inspired by some other Catholics, other Christians who have been getting onto YouTube and doing this kind of thing. Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism has been, you know, the two biggest objects circling the orbit of our discussions. And I mean, we talked about other things, but so we're really, we're at that point where we're not trying to make fun of Eastern Orthodoxy. We're not trying to make fun of Roman Catholicism. We kind of, this venue is to look at things from an objective point of view. And I know that in one sense that's not going to be possible, but in terms of being without bias. I'm a Roman Catholic, for example. Anybody who's seen the show for a little bit has seen that. But at the same time, I'll give you a perfect example. We're going to be having a show here soon where I'm going to present the good arguments for Eastern Orthodoxy as a true alternative. And I'm deeply invested in giving Orthodoxy its best platform. And so, yeah, I guess it's not possible to be both Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic at the same time. But as any of the viewers can see, we've had a debate between an atheist and a theist. We've had a debate with a Jewish rabbi and two Christians. We've had Muslim. We've had a discussion on Islam. We plan on having a debate with William Albright and a Muslim scholar, and so we're definitely going left to right on the whole horizon. But like I said, Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism was so much of the centripetal force around the orbit of our discussions that this has kind of been spilling into the publicity of our show. So. I guess it's a yes or no answer.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was a very good one. This one is for Christopher. So, Christopher, do you have, or does Christopher have any models, ideas, thoughts, and so forth for motivating the plausibility that a myriad of contingent effects can spring freely from God's unchanging, necessary action? This is from John DeRosa.
Right. So, this is where I guess we kind of run into the deeper motivation that's driving the argument that I criticize in my paper as being invalid, and where it's actually the subject, as I said before, of additional papers that I intend to write on this subject. Because although the argument that I talk about in the analysis paper is strictly speaking invalid, there is a concern here that Mr. DeRosa is putting his finger on, and that I think proponents of Aquinas' doctrine of divine simplicity have not yet given an adequate voice to. And so that deeper concern is the following, to try to capture it in the way that I think opponents of divine simplicity would, which is the following. Part of what divine simplicity does entail, if you want to think in terms of possible worlds, as contemporary philosophers are so fond of doing, is the following, namely that God is intrinsically indistinguishable across every possible world, right? So had God created a vastly different world than the world that we inhabit, or had God created no world at all, in those worlds, God would look, so to speak, exactly the same intrinsically as he does in this world. There would be no intrinsic differences in God across the possible worlds where he creates or doesn't create, or creates vastly different kinds of worlds than the one that we actually occupy. And so the problem that raises is, how could you have difference in the effects, namely the creatures, right? How could it be the case that you could have no creation, or a very different creation than we actually have, without there being any difference in the cause? And I guess just to preview the work that I'm doing currently on that is I have two brief replies to make to that. One is that I think when people are calling for that kind of explanation, how could we have a difference in the created effects without any difference, intrinsic difference in the uncreated cause, that they're calling for a kind of explanation that you ultimately can't get in every instance. It's called contrastive explanation. So whenever you ask questions like why X rather than Y, why is it the case that I'm sitting down with you guys tonight doing a podcast rather than out at dinner with my wife? And I can actually give explanations like that, at least in some cases, right? Because I'm not the most romantic type and I really enjoy talking about philosophy and theology. That would be an instance of contrastive explanation, why I explain why one thing is the case rather than another. Right, although everything has an explanation, right? That's what the principle of sufficient reason tells us. Everything has an explanation. I don't think that everything has a contrastive explanation. So if you ask, why does the world exist? I say, because God created it, right? So the explanation for why the world is that God created it. But if you ask me, why does this world exist rather than no created world? Or why does this created world exist rather than a created world in which unicorns are real, or that is vastly different in any other kind of way? I think that the proponent of a Thomistic doctrine of divine simplicity should simply say that's where explanation runs out. That in fact, you don't get a contrastive explanation. You don't get an explanation of why this world rather than any other. So the thing that's interesting about this is that the Thomist traditionally has been a very big proponent of the principle of sufficient reason. You can actually see this in Edward Feser's work. He does a lot of good work in his Scholastic Metaphysics book, defending the principle of sufficient reason as both something that's absolutely necessary for metaphysics to be coherent, as well as something that leads us to God, right? The principle of sufficient reason together with the contingency of creation gets us to God. But curiously enough, I think the Thomist ultimately also ends up being committed to denying something that's stronger, what we might call the contrastive principle of sufficient reason, or the version that says that every question of the form why A rather than B has an answer, due to this issue of God being intrinsically the same, even though his created effects have the possibility of being different. So the first move I make there is just to deny that contrastive explanations are always gonna, that we're always gonna have contrastive explanations. And here's the important part. Again, I don't think this is a problem that proponents of the doctrine of divine simplicity have alone. I think everybody has this problem, right? So let's say you want to reject the doctrine of divine simplicity because you really like contrastive explanation and you want to know how, you want to have good explanations for why different created worlds would exist, and you want to put that explanation in God. Then you're probably going to do that by just saying something like, well, God is intrinsically different across the different possible worlds in which he doesn't create, or he creates a world very different than the one that we inhabit. And the way that he's different is he has different intentions, right? So we're going to say, we're going to give up on the doctrine of divine simplicity and just say God has intentions, or God has some other intrinsic features that provide contrastive explanations for why the created order is different from world to world. The problem there is then, right, I mean, if you're such a big fan of explanation, I can push you a step further and say, okay, so why does God have the intentions that he has in those worlds? And you can explain that in some way. But at some point, you're going to have to explain God's contingent attributes. If you want to give up on the doctrine of divine simplicity, you're going to have to at some point explain God's contingent attributes in terms of his necessary or essential attributes. And once you're doing that, once you're explaining the contingent aspects of God in terms of the necessary aspects of God, you're engaged in pretty much exactly the same project that the proponent of the doctrine of divine simplicity is engaged in when they're explaining, when they're saying that you can't get contrastive explanations for how contingent creation, a different contingent creation emanates from a first cause that's intrinsically the same across every possible world. So everybody has this problem, I argue, about how you get the contingent stuff from the necessary stuff, even though there's no difference across possible worlds in the necessary stuff. Whether you think that that contingent stuff arises in God, if you don't like divine simplicity, or only arises in creatures if you do like divine simplicity. But either way, at some point explanation runs out and you have to just give up, I think, on a principle of sufficient reason that would be a contrastive principle of sufficient reason that would insist on there being contrastive explanations for every state of affairs. The other thing I say to that is I think we may have some empirical evidence that we don't get contrastive explanations for every contingent state of affairs in quantum mechanics. At least according to some interpretations of quantum mechanics, well, actually, no, this is just what quantum mechanics says on any interpretation. You could, for instance, have a particle that is radioactive and is going to decay. And what part of what quantum mechanics tells us is that there is no reason that can be located in the particle itself for why it decays at one time rather than another. The timing is in some sense inexplicable, at least in terms of the intrinsic properties of the particle. Now we can explain why the particle decays in terms of the mass of the particle, its radioactivity, et cetera, but we can't say why it decays at one time rather than another, right? So we have explanations for why what occurs, but we don't have contrastive explanations about why it happens in the way that it happens rather than another, or at the time that it happens rather than another. Now, people with very different metaphysical views might not like that empirical example, and I'm not, completely wedded to it myself. I'm just offering it up as a potential empirical counterexample to a demand for explanation that I think would be too strong, a demand for contrastive explanations in every case.
We have just a few minutes left. Eric, I have one more for you if you can answer it briefly. This one's from Brandon Thorpe. What do you think of the argument that to claim God's attributes as distinct and uncreated would diminish God's freedom?
Yeah, I took that one. I think he meant it for Christopher, but yeah, I think but he's asking, he's basically asking if you have distinction between God's attributes and they are uncreated, would that, and each of those attributes are uncreated, so we could see some of the problem piling up here, would that render God necessitated? Yeah,
Christopher, if you could take that one, that was actually meant for you. I think he sent it to Eric.
That makes sense. So I don't know, maybe you guys can help me understand the question. I'm not, so if God's attributes are distinct and uncreated, how would that diminish God's freedom? Exactly. I don't know that it would. It's not clear to me that it would diminish God's freedom. It would create all kinds of other problems, especially if you like a Thomistic doctrine of divine simplicity. But worries about diminishing God's freedom, I think, would be the least of your worries if God's attributes were all distinct and uncreated.
I was actually thinking the exact same thing. I'm not exactly sure how this would diminish God's freedom, but maybe he can elaborate further. And
I guess the opposite question might be a little bit more cogent, right? How could it be that God's attributes are all identical and uncreated, and yet God is free? But even there, I mean, it's not clear to me that there's a prima facie issue there. Other than perhaps the issue that we already talked about at the beginning of the video, the issue that I'm addressing, right? How could it be that God's will is identical with his essence and yet he's free? But that's exactly the issue that I'm addressing in the paper.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's pretty much going to do it for today. We're just about out of time. So, hey, Christopher, thank you so much for coming on again. I'd love to have you. Well, thank you for coming on. I'd love to have you on again if you'd be willing. I don't have a date yet, but maybe we could set something up in the future because I really want to talk more about this survivalist, corruptionist debate if you're willing and available.
Thank you again for having me on. It's been a lot of fun chatting with you, and I hope this is helpful to people who are wondering about this issue or just about divine simplicity in general. And yeah, I'd be happy to do this again sometime again on human nature and the interim state.
Awesome. And I'm sure we could throw in a couple more additional topics as well, if that's okay with you. So I'll get with you after the video and we'll set up a date. But again, thank you for coming on, Eric. Always a pleasure. Thank you for coming on. And everybody, please just not only comment, like, subscribe, share this material, but also take a look at our calendar. We have a lot of stuff coming up in the month of September. In fact, I think we have Dr. David Bradshaw coming up this week, if I'm not mistaken. I want to say it's on Friday, but we'll have to take a look at the calendar. But Dr. David Bradshaw, who, of course, he's going to be discussing Palimism with us. So we'll get the Eastern Orthodox perspective on some of these subjects. So everybody definitely tune in for that. But until next time, God bless you all. Thank you for watching, and go share your faith.
Thank you very much. God bless.